This episode of The Reality Check is brought to you by HelloFresh. Forget takeout. HelloFresh delivers all the ingredients for delicious, healthy meals anyone can prepare at home in less than 30 minutes. And HelloFresh is giving our Canadian checkers 50% off their first order. Go to hellofresh.ca and use promo code REALITY50 to get 50% off your first order. That's hellofresh.ca, promo code REALITY50. This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, a weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for April 11th, 2017, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
And producer Pat.
Hi everyone.
Cristina couldn't be here, but she sends her skeptical love to all you listeners. But as usual, we do have three interesting segments for you listeners. Pat is going to talk to us about a girl found living with monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And then Adam is going to talk to us about the origin of the dollar sign.
Indeed.
Ching ching. I assume that's a sound effect, Pat, you're going to put in. But first, I'm going to talk to you about priming. As listeners well know, one of the main side hobbies I do is researching large prime numbers. Or priming, as we call it in the biz. I kid, of course. Math is always funny. Priming, as I shall explore today, is an area of psychological research that has been quite popular and influential, and it hasn't been doing so well lately. Ooh. I'll cover what it is, a famous study that has come under fire, and then how the whole field now has complications.
This is like an ongoing theme for you, Darren.
It saddens my heart, but the quest for the truth must be done.
Taking down everything you learned in school one topic at a time.
Exactly.
Right?
What is it? Well, from Wikipedia, great author, priming is an implicit memory effect in which exposure to one stimulus, like a perceptual pattern, influences the response to another stimulus. The seminal experiments were in the early 1970s, and they showed that people were faster in deciding that a string of letters is a word when the word followed an associatively or semantically related word. For example, nurse is recognized more quickly when it is following doctor than when it is following bread. And that means like the word doctor will be very quickly flashed so you could barely even see it, and then you can recognize the word nurse more quickly because you were primed to have doctor in your mind, which then associated the concept of nurse. Sure. So that goes the idea. There are many different types of priming. For example, I could show you the word table and then later ask you to complete the word tab blank blank, and you're more likely to say table instead of something else because that word is more associated or primed in your head. Mm-hmm. Or how seeing the word dog might make you think not just of wolves, but cats, as they are also associated in your mind in some way with dogs because they're opposites. There have been numerous studies of this phenomena as it is a large area of research. That's a bit of the background, now to a famous study. Barg and co-authors Chen and Burrows published a paper in 1996 that found participants, who were students, walked more slowly when they were primed by words like Florida and wrinkle, words that supposedly link to the elderly.
Oh, wow.
And this finding was statistically significant at the good old p.05 level. The paper has been cited hundreds of times, mentioned in several books, including Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. This is social priming, where subtle cues in your environment could have large effects on your behavior in ways you don't realize, that are outside your awareness. And the social priming is the focus of my segment. So we can fast forward now to 2012, and researchers Doyen et al. Couldn't replicate Barg's findings. Barg did not concede. He actually was quite defensive. Yeah. He wrote an open letter saying it had already been replicated and it was time to move on to other work.
Wow.
But the issue did not go away. And this led to Kahneman writing a letter. He was so concerned, Kahneman wrote an open letter to Barg, to researchers in priming, saying that they have huge issues and pleading for them to do something. Kahneman said, quote, "Your field is now the poster child for doubts about the integrity of psychological research."
Wow.
And that, quote, "people have attached a question mark to the field and it's your responsibility to remove it." Kahneman says he wrote about the phenomenon in his book. He's still a general believer, but that his main reason for writing this letter is that he sees a train wreck looming. In his book Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman took a really hard line on priming. Quote, "Disbelief is not an option. The results are not made up, nor are they statistical flukes. You have no choice but to accept that the major conclusions of these studies are true." It is interesting that he was so overconfident because he and Tversky warned about this very thing almost 50 years ago in their work in the early 70s. In February of this year, Shimak, Hain, and Kesavan published a paper online called Reconstruction of a Train Wreck, How Priming Research Went Off the Rails. And they explored all of the studies in Daniel Kahneman's chapter of Thinking Fast and Slow that related to priming. And they state that 5 years later, Kahneman's concerns have been largely confirmed. Major studies in social priming research have failed to replicate. So being thorough, Shimek et al., they review every study that was mentioned in Kahneman's chapter to see if the findings hold up to scrutiny or if they were replicated, and the results are not good. For example, there's a famous study about holding a pencil in your teeth, which is somewhat like a smile, and it's thought this makes you happier. This failed to replicate across many labs, even when the analyses were combined. To show you how popular this finding was, there's actually a pencil with tooth marks on the cover of Daniel Kahneman's book.
Wow.
Yeah, these are like the power pose type findings. Yep. So they examined all the studies from whether shaking your head affects your mood, like if you're nodding yes versus shaking it no, unrelated tasks, right? Because you don't realize it's having an influence. If thinking about death tends to make you more conservative, how feeling shame might affect your word choice, and many, many others. They conclude that most of these were not likely to replicate. How could they know that without doing an actual replication? That's a good question. They use something called a replicability index. I'll give you an overview now, listeners, but more details are available in our links at trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
The gist is that you want to figure out how likely a given result can be replicated. And I'm going to quote Shimek et al. On the basics. Small samples can be sufficient to detect large effects. A large effect means something is larger in the world in terms of its occurrence, not frequency, but size. However, small effects require large samples. As you can think, if something's really small but true, you might have to test a lot of people to find it, depending on the area of research.
Yeah.
The probability of replicating a published finding is a function of sample size and effect size. So this is term power. By observing the many experiments and how these factors come into play, one can look at the published findings and see if there is anything suspicious. So you can't just do this with one experiment. It doesn't work that way because you don't have enough data. But often a published article will have many studies within it, and then you can look at that combined with many other published articles, and you get a nice, say, 20 or 30 sample, and you can get a sense of things. So here's a hint. Even if something is actually true, it should have some published findings indicating it isn't, because that's how the stats work out. Mm-hmm. But that's not usually what we see. So then you're like, oh, gee, this thing is true, and everything that's ever been published on it says it is. Well, that's suspicious, because that means there's this file drawer, as they say somewhere else, of findings that were not published, and that's a big problem. Yeah. So they found that there should have been a lot more non-significant results than were reported in the published articles. The selective reporting of studies that worked is at the core of the replicability crisis in social psychology, so they say. Yeah. Consequently, compared with Kahneman's point, they say you should not accept any of the conclusions of these studies as true. Wow. Now, if I had any doubts about this strong criticism, they were highly lessened when Kahneman commented on the Shimek et al.'s piece, and he said, I accept the basic conclusions of this blog. To be clear, I do so, 1, without expressing an opinion about the statistical techniques it employed, and 2, without stating an opinion about the validity and replicability of the individual studies I cited. What the blog gets absolutely right is that I place too much faith in underpowered studies. There's an interesting longer discussion here about what stats is and how it works in psychology, or actually anything, and how likely you are to find a certain finding versus something else. And it is tricky as part of the scientific method to figure out exactly how it should work. And we're seeing more and more that people don't quite know enough about what they're doing. They're either unintentionally or intentionally trying to get significant results, and that leads to a huge mess of problems. So all that to say, it seems like social priming is not doing well. I think we now have to update, so-called, our basic stance that any social priming experiment probably isn't true, or there'd have to be good reasons and see it already being replicated. The default belief meaning not true. Not for all priming, mind you. I still think word primes make a lot of sense, and certain concepts make a lot of sense. Like if I say dog, you're going to think of something related to dog versus banana for some reason. It doesn't really work that way. But I do think it's interesting how this might work, and I linked to an article in the show notes on Psychology Today talking about how a lot of the priming experiments don't even make sense from an evolutionary point of view. For example, one study showed that when participants were holding a warm, say, cup of coffee or hot chocolate, they started to think warmer thoughts about other people. You're like, well, that doesn't necessarily make adaptive sense. Just because you're feeling a bit warm, you like other people more, that might not be that useful.
That's like so your brain's making an association that works like with a pun in the English language.
Well, that's it. It's the idea that, yes, there are the spreading activation across your brain that certain concepts are getting conflated or confused. That I'm feeling warmth, and that's somewhat similar to a feeling you get around certain people. Yeah. Now, we do know that human beings engage in many behaviors where aren't actually adaptive, but I do think it was interesting. And his main point is that priming seems to be specific to a function, not a generalization. Obviously, there's a tip of the iceberg type thing here. Like, well, how is priming different than memory? Because when you think of almost anything and you have a memory about it, obviously it's related in some sort of conceptual association or some sort of experiential association. So there is, as I said, it's just much more complicated. So I think the good default is that social priming should be viewed very suspiciously, and other ones you might have to go investigate on a case-by-case basis.
But certainly the idea that if I use the word lemon and then I've sort of primed you to say the word yellow. But it seems like it's taking it too far, or...
Well, right, I think that's a good example, Pat. So that, to me, goes into that sort of almost the lexical, functional category, while it's not quite the social priming. Sort of like if you say lemon, and now I feel soured towards someone.
Right.
You're like, well, I don't know if that really makes sense. Like, actually, it's kind of like intuitively appealing. You're like, when you say lemon, my face does kind of squish up a bit, makes me think of disgust. I, therefore, find certain things more disgusting. You're like, but I don't think it actually works that way. Yeah. But a lot of these findings were pretty popular, like in something called terror management theory. The more you threaten people, say with terrorism, the more people tend to vote conservative. That seems to fit a certain worldview a lot of people have, and I don't think that really holds up either. Mm-hmm. Oh, psychology. Now, listeners, I'm sure we've all felt we live among some monkeys from time to time, but there might have been a girl who actually was living among some monkeys. Pat, is that true?
Right. So a few days ago, 2 headlines showed up in my newsfeed. Feral girl found with monkeys in a forest in India. That was IFL Science. And Mowgli girl found living with monkeys. And that was People magazine. Did you guys see anything about this?
I did not.
Okay.
No, but I would say the Mowgli title is probably a smarter title than I would have gone with a Tarzan or Blanca reference.
Right.
So good on them.
A lot of news outlets have picked up on this story, which seems to have first been reported on April 6th by several Indian news sources. Times of India reported that the girl was 8 years old and that she had recently been found. Asian News International reported that she was 10 and that she had been found back in January. Another report suggested that she was 12 years old. The rest of the details were pretty similar. Police in Uttar Pradesh in northern India found a girl in the forest after being alerted by local villagers. She was naked and playing with a group of monkeys as if she was one of them. She looked emaciated and her hair was disheveled, but she seemed calm until police approached. When that happened, the monkeys surrounded the girl, protecting her as if they were one of her own, and attacked an officer as the girl screeched at him. After rescuing the girl, the officer sped away in his patrol car with the monkeys chasing him. She was taken to hospital and admitted. Asian News International reported interviewing the hospital's chief medical officer, D.K. Singh, who said that the girl was completely unfamiliar with human language and described the girl as walking, eating, and screeching like an animal, and added, quote, "She looked like she had lived with the animals for quite some time."
Wow.
All right, so the idea of a feral child being raised by animals is not a new one. In a 2016 article for the Center of Inquiry, scientific paranormal investigator Benjamin Radford points out that these legends go back at least as far as Romulus and Remus of Roman mythology and the legend of the founding of Rome. Mm-hmm. Probably the most famous fictitious characters are Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Jungle, a boy raised by African apes, and, as one of the headlines I mentioned suggests, the fictitious character Mowgli from Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. But there are also real-world stories of feral children being raised by animals. In 1824, a 12-year-old boy who came to be known as Wild Peter was found in Germany. It became a celebrated case, and it was heralded as an example of, quote, natural man. Then there's the story of Amala and Kamala, 2 young girls found in India in the 1920s who were supposedly raised by wolves. There is a 1997 best-selling memoir called Misha, a memoir of the Holocaust years, which was written by a woman who claimed she escaped the Holocaust as a child into the forest where she was raised by a pack of wolves. So not all reported cases of feral children have been completely proven as hoaxes, but according to Radford, most of them have. A German naturalist examined the earliest documents on Wild Peter and concluded that he must have lived with people until shortly before he was captured. For example, parts of his body were pale rather than tanned, indicating that he had recently been wearing pants. Most of the details of Amala and Kamala's story come from a single source, the diary of Reverend J.A.L. Singh, and it's generally accepted that he faked or exaggerated his interactions with the children.
I am shocked a reverend would believe something that's not true.
The 1997 memoir of the young Jewish girl was later exposed as a fictional hoax, and the author confessed in 2008. Radford writes, quote, "Feral children, if they ever truly existed, are a relic of the past. Except in the most remote regions of the world, certificates are issued for live births, and it's unlikely that a child would be born and somehow completely disappear into the wild to be raised by animals. Even if a family lived in the remote jungle and both parents died suddenly, the lost infant or child would likely starve to death or be eaten by wild animals instead of being nurtured into adolescence by them." So, back to this recent case. Within a few days of the sensational headlines, news stories from The Guardian and the Hindustan Times came out quoting other officials. J.P. Singh, the district chief forestry officer, says that the girl was actually found on the roadside near the forest, not deep in the forest, and although there were monkeys in the area, that his rangers, quote, "never found this girl living with monkeys." He also says that the forest is a wildlife sanctuary, which is closely monitored by rangers and closed-circuit television, making it unlikely that she would have been there for any length of time without being spotted. Villagers who first saw her on the side of the road say that she was in fact wearing clothes, and a police spokesperson said that they believe she was left by the side of the road on the morning or afternoon that she was found. The chief medical officer of the district agrees, saying it was unlikely she had been raised in the forest, much less by monkeys. He believes that she has mental and physical disabilities, which were mistaken for evidence that she has been living without human contact in the jungle. In an attempt to find her family, the police released information about the girl to media, but no one responded. The police now suspect that someone from a distant village abandoned her because she has not been recognized by people living in the area. Sadly, this appears to be a situation where a mentally and physically disabled young girl was left on the side of the road by someone who couldn't or did not want to care for her, rather than a story of a feral child raised by monkeys as originally reported.
Oh, that's not good at all.
It's very sad.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt, for that interesting expose. Saddening what the truth is, but sometimes we have to be skeptical of things, even if it turns out a less happy story. What is happy is money for everyone. Cha-ching, $, origins. Adam, explain.
Why is the sign for the dollar an S with a slash in it? Other signs that indicate currency are more straightforward. The British pound is denoted by an L for the Latin word for pound, libra. The Japanese yen is a modified Y. Even the cent is shown as a C with slash in it. So why is the dollar sign in S with 1 or 2 slashes through it?
Dollars.
Dollars. I never gave this question much thought until recently when I read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. In this book, one character states that the dollar sign is a monogram for the United States of America. It would be a U and an S superimposed, this being the variant of the dollar sign with 2 strikes through it. The story takes place in a fictional future United States where money is largely vilified. The idea is that the United States, by vilifying money, has gone against the symbol which represents its own country. Oh, isn't that crazy? Interesting concept, I thought. Any truth to it? As it would turn out, we don't know exactly why the dollar sign is an S with slashes through it, but we can evaluate the strength of the numerous explanations. It seems that the U and S claim for the origin of the dollar sign comes from Ayn Rand's 1957 novel, Atlas Shrugged. There isn't any substantial evidence that this is the actual origin of the symbol. We can actually discount this theory by the fact that the dollar sign, as we know it, was in existence before the founding of the United States of America in the late 18th century. The first official use of the dollar sign was by Robert Morris, and it used the single slash, which also doesn't fit with this explanation. So what, then, does the symbol mean? What's this S all about? One idea says that it's a version of the letters H, I, and S the Greek abbreviation for Jesus superimposed.
Oh.
This explanation doesn't have much to back it up. To get to the next explanations, we need to consider the origin of the dollar. The term dollar was around for hundreds of years before the US dollar, but not used formally for currency. It's an anglicized form of the word thaler, which were coins made of silver from the Jauchismal area in Bohemia. This term became used to describe other coins in Europe, and the Spanish peso, which was referred to as the Spanish dollar. The dollar originated in America, in the New World, where there was a shortage of British coins. The Spanish peso was referred to English-speaking people as a dollar. This was circulated amongst the North American colonies. Even after the US was formed, it was the principal coin circulated until they began minting their own dollars in 1794. So, with the dollar having its origins in the Spanish peso, also known as the Spanish dollar, we can look at a few options for where that symbol might have come from. Spanish pesos were what is referred to as pillar dollars. They contain the pillars of Hercules, which is a symbol found on the Spanish coat of arms. These would be the two slashes in the dollar sign. The pillars are shown with a scroll surrounding them. This scroll would be the S. A dollar sign would have originally represented this coin, and then it would have been called the dollar, which then would have been adopted when the US adopted that name for its currency. Another idea is that it has a combination of a P and an 8. The Spanish dollar is known as the Peso de Ocho Reales, or piece of 8, or 8 real coin. Here the 8 became the S, and the P is the line through it. So again, this symbol to describe the currency would have been kept once the US dollar was adopted. Still going on the peso idea, some attribute it specifically to pesos mined in Potosi. These were monogrammed with the letters PTSI, all sort of overlapped one on top of each other. Since Potosi was a large silver mine, much of the Spanish dollars of the time in America came from there and carried this monogram. If you look at the symbol that this creates, it does bear a striking resemblance to the modern dollar sign. But none of these are the most widely accepted interpretations. So what is? The Spanish dollar, known as the peso, Peso de Ocho Reales, was abbreviated as lowercase ps. The S was above and to the right of the P, the two superimposed on each other a bit. As time went on, as the story goes, the P and the S got mashed together into the dollar sign. The PS abbreviation and the dollar sign are seen used in the late 18th century until eventually the PS abbreviation faded. So much to say, we don't know the exact reason. The UNS or the IHS abbreviation for Jesus explanations are the least likely. Of the Pillars of Hercules, P and 8, PTSI, or P and S explanations, the latter with the P and the S getting mashed together seems to be the most likely explanation that we've seen. Sorry, Ayn Rand, it looks like the origin of the dollar as described in Atlas Shrugged isn't legitimate and may possibly even have been fabricated solely for this purpose. It is unknown whether Ayn Rand was herself mistaken about this or simply made it up as part of her final work of fiction.
Who would have thought Ayn Rand would have been wrong about something? And thanks for joining us once again, listeners. I talked to you about social priming and how you should be very skeptical of any studies that say it is valid and that they found something. Pat told us about feral children that may have existed in the past, but the current case is not a candidate. It just sounds like a girl that needed our help and didn't get any. And Adam explored the myth supported by Ayn Rand about the origin of the dollar sign. And it sounds like it was due to some Spanish people somewhere. Maybe. Until next time, think better, act better.
Peso cuboids.
So funny.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes. Bucks dollars. Y is the sign for the dollar.
Why? Let me tell you, friends, I'm curious.